Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Excel Essential Functions and Shortcuts. This is Marcia Lucas, and this is section 2 of our workshop. In this section, we're going to talk about the power of formatting. We'll go through color code conventions. We'll talk about how you set up your formulas, makes it easier or less easy to copy and paste stuff, and then some custom formatting to allow you to mix text with numbers. Let's start with the industry standard color codes. If you see a cell in a spreadsheet that's colored blue, the font color is blue, that means this is an input cell. It's hard-coded. A user has to put information into that cell. This is really important because input cells should drive your output. You don't want to put numbers into formulas. You want your spreadsheet to be flexible enough to adjust to different kinds of inputs. So color those cells blue, and that way your users will know where to go to put that new data. Black would be formulas, titles, things that shouldn't require any edits. Once you put a formula into your spreadsheet, test it really thoroughly, make sure it always gives you the right answer, and then you should never have to go there again. If you're getting a weird answer in the cell, it's because of the data that's feeding that formula, not because of the formula themselves. If you're color coding area green, it means that that area of your spreadsheet is getting data from another area of your spreadsheet. This is really important when a spreadsheet has multiple tabs, like my 16-tab spreadsheet from hell I talked about in session 1. Then I know that I don't want to mess with this green area. I want to look at the formulas in there, find out where it's getting its information, and go to the source if I have to debug my spreadsheet. Burgundy would be data that's pulled in from an external source, like FactSet or Bloomberg or Yahoo Finance or something like that. Also very helpful. If there's something funny about those cells, it's probably something with the data that it's bringing in that's causing the problem. Color coding makes your spreadsheet easier to use and easier to understand. So again, it's always about being fast and efficient and accurate, and color coding helps. The next thing to be aware of is when to use an absolute reference when you're putting a formula in or a function, and when to use a relative reference. An absolute reference has dollar signs before either the column or the row reference or both to anchor that reference. So if I have an input cell and I'm going to use that same input for a lot of different calculations, I want to anchor that input cell. So if I'm copying and pasting my formula to different parts of my spreadsheet, it will still always refer back to that input cell. If I am going to collect, copy and paste down a table, and the data I'm using for my function is in a row by row, I want it to be relative to its place in the table. I don't want it to anchor back to some other reference point. So that would be a relative reference where you're just going to copy and paste like down or across, and it's going to use whatever data is in that physical proximity to the formula as the original location where you wrote the formula. So absolute and relative, we're going to do some practice. It'll make some more sense. Now charting. Pictures are much faster at transmitting information than letters or numbers. So you can see in this table, it's a months and it's sales, and okay, I know what it's there, but it's difficult for me to interpret the information very easily just looking at a bunch of numbers. But if I graph it, I can see that there's some distinct seasonality in the data and a big spike here in the fourth quarter of the year. This is probably some kind of a retailer that has big holiday sales. So that's important for me to know. If I were just going to scan this information, I wouldn't be able to see the pattern very readily. So when you can, take that data and convert it to a nicely formatted table or a chart or a graph so that your user can very quickly interpret the information. If you want to use keystrokes, which we do always, to make a graph, you're going to do the Alt key to get your menu, then N for insert, and then R is a recommended graphs. And that's very helpful to put a graph into your spreadsheet, which we'll do in a second. So I've laid out a bunch of tasks for you on the Formula Basics tab of your spreadsheet. So let's go there now. So the first thing I want to do always is kind of get myself oriented. I always like to start with Control Home to take my cursor up to that topmost cell A1. Then it's easier to navigate from there. So let's take a look at these red statements. Those are things I want you to do and see how successful we can be at each of these assignments. First thing, format this field as a %. All right, Alt-H gets me to that home screen, and P is for %. And if you follow, it's right there. Okay. The next thing it says is to change the color coding to indicate input cells. Well, this is an input cell for sure. I'm going to use it. I actually like to center it as well. And I'll just use my mouse here and find a nice blue color. I like that blue color. If I needed more decimals, I would go ahead and expand it. Sometimes your mouse is going to be the fastest way to do this stuff. Sometimes it's keystrokes, depends on where you are in your spreadsheet. So first thing done, no problem. Next thing, write a formula using an absolute reference and then copy that down. But before I do that, is there any benefit to this data set being non-contiguous? I have month, then I have a space, then I have sales, I have a blank column, right? Tax, blank column. No, there's no benefit to that. By doing that, if I do Control Left, it doesn't go anywhere. I have to do 4 of them before I get all the way to the edge. Don't make your user do that much work. So I'm going to just take this whole set, I'm going to cut it, Control X, and then I do left arrow, and I'm going to paste it, Control V. Now that doesn't get everything, but it gets us started. My next set, Control X, Control V, and my next set, Control X, Control V. You might notice that I'm copying this entire blank area because it will then just kind of overwrite whatever was taking up space next to my contiguous data. Now it is kind of cramped up here, so fine, no problem. Just make it bigger. I double-clicked on this little edge here to widen that cell. Well, that was definitely too wide. It just looks at the widest inputs in that cell. There was some text later on. How about this one? Yeah, still, there's too much text. So I'll just drag it. And there. So it's still contiguous now. Control left, control right, control down. It's going to now move around a lot easier. This is important because we're going to want to autofill. And autofill works best when you have contiguous data. It's going to notice where this data ends so it knows where to stop. So this first one, write a formula with absolute reference, copy and paste down. So I'm going to clear that text. I don't really have to, but I'm going to. What's my formula? Sales tax equals the sales times the tax rate. Simple enough. Am I done? No, because this tax rate is the same for all of these sales, so I want to anchor it. I can click in here and I can use my F4 key if it only worked, but it does not on my particular keyboard. So I'm going to go ahead and anchor it with my $signs manually. Just click in that cell, put the $sign in there. Now that it's there, I need to change the color because it's a simple formula. I'm going to center it to get a little bit of space, and I can use my autofill here, double click, and it knows where to go because my data is contiguous, so it has a reference point. Now the next one says use a relative reference for net sales. How come? Well, first, I'm doing Shift Control down to get rid of that text. Net sales, it's just the sales minus the tax. Now in that case, this reference will always want to increment as I copy down the row. I don't need any fixed point, so I don't have to anchor anything. So again, I'm going to center that, I'm going to make it black again, and I can do my autofill, and it's done. Remember that autofill works now because the data is contiguous. Otherwise it would not have worked, and you could have dragged it down, but autofill is faster, right? And it's all about being fast. The next thing, shall we graph it first? Sure, let's graph it first. Graph the trend of monthly sales. Then we're going to add moving average and do some other stuff. So I'm putting my cursor where I can still see my instructions, and now, as I said, we can use menu keys for this. But first, let's highlight our data. So Control Left, take me to my data here, and this is what I'm after. I'm going to Shift Control, and I'm going to get that whole set. But I don't really want the whole set, actually. I only want sales. So, and Shift Control down, and I get that set of information. So I'm telling Excel, this is the data I'm working with. What do you recommend? Alt, N for insert, and then R, recommended charts. It's over here. It's going to give me a set of charts. So we've got a typical line chart. This is what I had on our slide a minute ago. I have bar charts. I have this kind of sediment chart. There's other kinds of charts. I'm going to work with a bar chart. I like the idea of a bar chart. So I just clicked on that one, click OK. We can do several things with this chart. I'm just going to move it first of all so I can see. The first thing I'm suggesting we do with it is to add a linear and a moving average trend line. So now that I have my chart, I'm going to click on this plus, and I can add elements. Let's see. In this list, I have trend line. So great. I'm going to add a trend line. Okay. And that's helpful. I can see the trend is up, but there's a lot of variability in there. So it would be more helpful, I think, to have a more sophisticated trend line. So I'm going to click on this arrow here, and it gives me some choices. How about a moving average? That might be more helpful, and that's what I see now on my line. I have this simple trend, and then I've got this moving average, which shows the cyclicality. Now, these are also a little bit hard to see because they're all the same color. So I'm clicking on my line. I'm going to right-click on there, and I can format the trend line, and I can just pick a different color. I go here to my paint can, and I pick some color that's not blue. Everything right now is blue. I'll just pick orange. It's right next to it. Okay, now it's easier to see. How about that first trend line? Let's make that another color as well. Right-click, format trend line, go to the paint, and maybe I'll make that one green. It's also a little bit narrow. I'm going to go to the width here, make it a bit bigger so I can see it better. Okay. And there we go. I've got a nice chart. I've got not only the monthly sales, I've got the trend there, and I've got this moving average, so I can really see that cyclicality. That's a useful chart. Way more useful than just looking at a table full of numbers. Moving on to this next table, let's format this to be a little bit more user-friendly as well. I've got volume up here and prices down here, but there's no notation to indicate that these are quantities and these are prices. So let's start there. I go Shift Control down, I get that whole section. I do Alt H, and I want it to be currency. So I did Alt H FM to get into my formatting cells. I want it to be currency. I don't, in this case, yeah, I do need some decimals, so it's set for 2, and that's fine. And now at least I can see that those are dollars, and these are not. That's helpful information. Formatting helps your user understand what you're trying to accomplish. I think it would also be helpful to make all of this stuff bold. So I'm just doing Control-Shift, went too far. And I'll do Control-B to make it bold. And then over here, Shift-Control down, Control-B, make it bold. Now, prices are one thing, sales quantity is another. I may as well shade that up as well. Alt-H, H, Alt-H. Let's give that a color of its own. I will pick this nice color. And then the quantity, I did Shift, Control down and over. Let's give this one something else. Alt-H. Let's make this one just green. The colors here, they're not really important, but what I've done is to group this for the viewer. These are our sales volume. These are prices. Otherwise, it's not immediately obvious. Okay, now, if I have volume and price, I can come up with sales or expected sales. It would be really helpful if this was labeled. But, oops. So let me click on this first cell here in the table. I'm going to multiply quantity times price, and I'm going to get sales. Okay. I could, again, Alt-HFM and set that as currency if I wanted to do that. Maybe it'll be a little cluttered, but we'll try it. Now, what do I want to anchor here? I'll click in there again, you can see. I've got quantity, I've got price. Well, if I copy it down, my price needs to change, but my quantity should not. So I'm going to anchor that reference C23. And do not want that to change as I copy my cell down. Okay, and so then I can do an autofill. And it only went down that far because it was following my text that I had in there. So I'm going to get rid of this so it works better. Okay, so can I then just copy these whole things over here? Control C, move over one right arrow, Control V, and not exactly. Why not? Let's take a look at our formula. Now it's looking at a different quantity, but I didn't anchor my price over here. So instead of multiplying times price in column B, it's multiplying times sales. And then it would keep doing that as I copied across. All right, that's not going to work. Go back, go over one. I need to anchor this column B. So on the one hand, I need to anchor my row for the volume. And over here, I need to anchor my column for the price. Now, I think I got it. So I can do this, and I can drag it over, or I can do Control V, Control C. Now I'm having a hard time dragging. So Control C, and then I can drag it over there, Control V. So what do you suppose is wrong over here? Maybe I did something wrong. These ones look okay. In this case, there's probably nothing wrong with it. The formula, if it was working here and here and here, it should be working there. It's probably just not enough space in my table. So let's see if there's no weird, yeah, there's still weird text. There's text below there somewhere in that spreadsheet, so it got too big. But now I can see it. It just, those hash marks just meant that there wasn't enough data, or sorry, wasn't enough room to, there we go, to reflect all the data that it had to share with me. So when you see hash marks, sometimes it's an error message, and sometimes it's just spacing. So you have to check into it and see which it is. So we have a nicely formatted table. I can see what I'm doing here and change color coding to distinguish between inputs and outputs. Okay, which we did. All right. What else do we have? Some more functions. Replace hard-coded numbers with links to the data above. All right, this is another just list of sales, give for each of those months like we did before. We can just reference, I didn't just go equals, go up to the top where my sales were, and reference it there, and color-coded green. That's not a very good green, can't see it very well. I'll pick a darker green so I can see it. I'll just pick this dark ester green. And now I can autofill. It's going to follow whatever numbers were there before. So if you have input someplace in your table, don't ever enter it again. I didn't put these as blue. Should have, because those are input cells. So then I could remember that. Which blue am I using? There's so many choices. I guess I'll use that one. So now those are the input cells, which would lead me down, Control down, 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 down. Whoa, too far. Here, I know that they're coming from somewhere else. Where are they coming from? I can see it in the cell reference. Last thing, now that I have all this information, let's just practice doing some formulas. Total annual sales, enter the necessary Excel function. Okay, the easiest thing to do is Alt and equals. Hold Alt and hit equals, and boom. As long as there's nothing in that range that you don't want, you've got your total. Lovely. Average equals average. You gotta type correctly. Now I'm gonna have, there's no way around it. I have to space up, Shift Control, and then I can go all the way to the top of my data. And now I've got the average. Highest equals max. Again, there's no way around it. I'd have to tab up or arrow up, Shift Control, and down. Equals max, equals min. You get the idea. So one thing that I'll talk about a little bit more is the standard deviation, STDEV, and there's a bunch of choices here. I use STD, standard deviation, P of the population. And I do that because we are not working with a sample. And if you remember the long version of your standard deviation formula, which you may not, Once you get all of your deviations, you divide by n, or n minus 1. The regular standard deviation formula says n minus 1 because it assumes you're working with a sample, that it doesn't represent the exact parameters of the population. But in our case, we're almost always working with the entire data set. We don't have to assume some degree of representativeness of the data. So I put the p in there. We're working with the whole population. So we divide by n instead of n minus 1 is what Excel is doing. Open my paren. Again, I can click on this one, shift control up, and then hit enter, and there we go. Let's see if that's everything. Yep, not too bad, right? Let's go back to our slideshow. Okay, now we're going to move on to custom formats where you can mix text with numbers. Now, what we're really doing is faking it, because Excel cannot do math with text. So as soon as you put a text and a number together, you converted the whole cell to text and your math is gone. But what you can do is create a custom format that concatenates, or it appends a text element with a number so that when it displays, it looks like the way you want it, but the number is still intact. This is really important for things like dates, where you want to say as of certain date. If you type as of November 30th, 2019, that becomes an entire text cell. But if you custom format and add the as of, I'll show you how to do that in quotes, then the number remains intact. The other common place we see this is multipliers. This is so many times that, where you want to put an X in it. The debt is 2 times equity, 2X, or the price earnings ratio is 21 times, 21X. That X is going to screw up your data unless you put it in parentheses and keep it separate from the number. So we'll do some of that in a second. So we're going back to our spreadsheet. There's another tab called Custom Formats, and we're going to do some of these actions now. Custom Formats. So there's not a ton of stuff here, but we're just going to make sure we understand exactly what's going on. So I have some dates. I have August 3rd, and I have December 2017. I have some values. Notice I've color-coded them. This one's black because it's not an input field. It's a formula. Equals today. So it always shows up with today's date. Sometimes that's good, sometimes it's not good, but this is the way I wanted it to build. So that's the way I did it. I have some input market values basically, and I have ending date and beginning date. What I want to do is add these ending date and beginning date text to my actual calendar dates here. And we're going to do it down here. So first I'm going to put equals, and I'm going to reference this one. It gave me a number. Do you remember what that number is? Right. It's a Julian date. So that's just 44,046 days from the beginning of the calendar as created by Julian. I think he was a monk somewhere. So I have to convert it. First of all, let's convert it to a date. Alt-H, FM, and let's see, a normal date. I'd like it all written out, but without the day. So I'm going to pick this standard format. Okay, fine, no problem. But now I want to put that text in there as well. So let me go back. Now I'm just going to use my mouse because my hand's already on my mouse. I'm going into custom, and here is my function. Well, what I want to put in front of that date function is some text. So I put quote, double quotes, and then I put ending date. There you go. And let me put a space in there so that it spaces out nicely. And now you can see in the sample, ending date of August 3rd. It's still a number though. It's still a date. Excel can still do math with it. If I Control C, Control V, it should also work for this last one. It probably just doesn't have quite enough space. Yeah, it just took up a little bit more space. I don't want ending data though here, right? Alt-H, FM. Instead, this one should say beginning date. So I'm just clicking right in here, beginning date. There you go. Oh, took up some more space. Okay. Now I could also concatenate, but when you concatenate, then you're you're combining two things into, again, it's going to cause it to be a text field instead of a number field. So this custom formatting is better to keep the numbers preserved. Now that I have these dates here, I can do math. This formula is calculating the number of years. So what Excel can do is just take the difference between these two dates in Julian dates. It's just a number of days. And then I divide it by 365 to get years. Once I have years, then I can do math. I want to calculate my annualized return. So take the difference in my market values. I raise it to a power of 1 over the number of years. And notice I put a cell reference here. I don't want to put number of years in there because every time I open the spreadsheet, I'd have to change the formula, which is annoying. Instead, this input field changes. It's not a human input field, but it is an input to the function so that I don't have to mess with it. So everything works, it's great. What is that if error thing I added? Well, let's go back and just get rid of this and get rid of that. Suddenly there's text in here that wasn't there before. So I put an if condition in here so that it could be even more helpful to the user. If error, if it can't do the calculation because it has no data in this case, do something. So here's the function. It wasn't able to calculate it, so I put a comma. If, then, else is our syntax, if, then, else. So I put a comma. If this is an error, it can't work, put in this text, quote, enter formatted dates in column B. Okay. So now I know where that text came from, and I can undo. I can do Control Z, and undo all of that stuff, and now I have my numbers. Moving on to this bottom section, here's a bunch of different ways to format numbers. Which number format is better? Depends on what you're trying to do. Number one rule of thumb, they all should be the same. If it's in a table, format them all the same. If you're using a comma separator, use it for all the data in your table. If you're using 2 decimals, you use them for everything in that same column, and just be consistent. I always like my commas because it helps me line up my numbers better. I can interpret them quickly, the magnitude of the number, so I prefer this to that. I also prefer brackets to minus signs. And that's because those parentheses, they're easier to see. They're going to catch my attention. Where that tiny little minus sign there, I might overlook it, and then I'm going to interpret the data wrong. Percentages are better than decimals. So even in this case, I don't even have my decimals. So I can widen this up and I can see 0.05. Okay, it's accurate, kind of, needs a few more decimals, but it's not very helpful. It's easier for me to interpret percents as percents and use the precision that is necessary for the task at hand. If you're doing some kind of forecasting, you probably don't need a lot of precision because you're guessing. So don't make it look like it's more precise than it really is. But in some cases, like with bonds, we take our decimals out to 5 decimal places all the time, because that's just the degree of precision in our industry. So do it relevant for the field that you're in. If you're talking about numbers, at least at the beginning of your column, give me a $sign, and don't use the accounting format. This one up here, this little $sign, that's an accounting format. And what it does is it puts your $sign, it's not going to do it right now because this is text, but it puts your $sign way on the left-hand side of your column. And that may not be, it doesn't look very good, right? Otherwise, do it as currency. You usually don't need the pennies, so I take off those decimal places, and it'll put your $sign right next to your number. All right. 2.5 times something, 2.5x. How are we going to deal with that? So I'm adding my decimal places, and now I'm going to go up here to my formatting and custom formatting. Well, start with the number. I always start with the numbers. It's a standard number. It's going to be 1 decimal place, so that's what I got so far. Back to custom. Now it's given me this very complicated little thing here. I don't really care what it says right now. I'm just adding an X to the end. Quote, X, close quote. And now it should give me, it gave me trouble last time I did this. So here, let's just take all of that out. And there's my nicely formatted cell. It has a little space at the end. I don't know why. Take that out of there. Okay, now it looks the way I want it to. All right, have the user in mind when you're formatting these cells. Make it as easy for them to interpret your information as possible. If it is fast and accurate, your boss, your teammates, whoever it is who's reading that report will appreciate the work that you went into to make it easy for them to understand the information. That's it. So we use shortcut keys, put in some formulas, we're getting some formatting down, so we're getting more and more able to make our spreadsheets easy to understand, and that's the point. And when we go on to session 3, we're going to start getting a little bit more complicated, a little bit more sophisticated, and create reports that are more dynamic and yeah, a little bit harder to put together, but very useful and very powerful. So I'll see you in session 3.